We'll go ahead and kick things off here. Um, Let a few more folks roll in, but for those that are here, we first want to say hello. I know this will also be recorded, so folks who can't join and are going to watch this later, hello to you all as well. Um, I would say that April and I are both very, very excited for our Blueprint Live #2 session here. I think it's a topic that both her and I are very passionate about. And I think we were joking earlier that we've had like 50 different practice webinars over the last 2 weeks because this has been a topic that has come up so frequently with both prospects and customers alike. So we feel like well-practiced seasoned vets here ready to chat more about measuring business impact versus activity. A lot of folks think about this in the context of kind of that project management and strategic planning. How do those fit together? How are they different? But I would say, especially right now, as folks who typically have that calendar year, fiscal year, are getting deep into their planning season, this topic has just naturally come up on, it feels like every other call that we're on. So we're really excited to dive in here today and talk more about it. This is something that from the onset of Elate, we've always been really passionate about. But something that I think just as things have evolved over the last few years and businesses have changed how they're thinking about strategy, how they're building it, this is something that seems to come up for every single company out there. So again, excited to dive in deeper here. To kick things off, we'll go ahead and start with introductions. But again, want to say thank you to all of those who joined in our the first session of Blueprint Live, where we talked all about the strategic planning framework. We talked about what it looks like to start from those operational metrics and work that all the way down. We're going to be spending a lot of our time today talking more on the objective level and those kind of tactics and outcomes for those that joined last time. If you weren't able to join the last session, that's okay. I'm going to do a little bit of recap in here, but I would encourage you to go check that out. So if you had registered, you should have gotten the recording already. If not, we'll go ahead and drop a link to that in the chat, and you can watch that afterwards. And I think it might be helpful too, to just add some more color to what we're going to be talking about today. But again, that'll be in the chat for anyone who wants to go watch that afterwards. That shared, we'll kick things off with some introductions. For many of you on the chat, I think I've had the chance to meet you. There's quite a few new names though. So if I haven't had the chance to meet you, hello, my name's Abby Parker. I'm one of the other co-founders here at Elate and our current COO. Our other co-founder, Brooks, helped lead the last session, but he and I started Elate together about 5 years ago, and both come from the world of strategy and operations ourselves, and just are extremely passionate about it, enough to say, hey, let's go start a company on this, and have been doing that ever since. And I get to also oversee our customer experience and customer success team. So I get to work with a lot of our customers, and even talk to some kind of in that pre-sales process. So that's a little bit about myself. Background is primarily in operations, doing what I think many of you all are doing at your companies. And kind of some of the challenges that I ran into there were a big reason behind kind of saying, hey, joining Brooks and joining forces there to create Elate. April, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's April McDonald, and I'm a solutions consultant here at Elate. So I get to work with our customers and prospects as they're starting to figure out what their plan can look like in Elate and how they're able to get that in there. So really excited. I do have a background in project management. So as Abby mentioned, this is a topic very near and dear to us. So we've talked about this at length together. And as she mentioned, I feel like I've had quite a few practice webinars this week, as this has been a hot topic with our prospects and customers. So super excited to dive in today and get to talk more about this.
Awesome. We're going to kick things off with a quick question for everyone. So we want to take a step back before we dive into what we're talking about here and have you all think about a North Star metric for your business. So a key KPI, maybe a number you frequently come back to as a leadership team, or that you are driving towards as a company. And for anyone whose first number that came to mind is your top level revenue number, I want to challenge you to think of another one. So again, top level North Star metric for your business. Some folks, if you lean more finance heavy, you might be starting to think about things like gross margin or EBITDA. On the other side, we often will see folks look at things like if you're in a recurring revenue model, looking at things like your NRR, maybe that's a really important metric that you're talking with your board on. Maybe there's a ARR to full-time employee count, something like that. But we want to start thinking there because, as I mentioned in the last session, we really started with those operational metrics. And we're going to come back to this and kind of weave this into how it relates to our topic today. But I think it's a really helpful place to start to think about, what do you typically have to measure? Do you want to be measuring to get a pulse on your business? Maybe it's something you're reporting to the board or just talking about on a weekly basis as a leadership team. So, all right. When we start to think about this number, we often see this at a really, really high level. And then as we start to see strategic plans, we start to see these numbers kind of like vanish in the layers. So we're going to talk more about how to bring that down to a more granular level at the objective level, but it's always helpful to start with one in mind. Before we dive too deep there, though, we really want to take a step back to just define the difference. When we talk about business impact and we talk about activities, how do those fit together? Do they fit together? What happens when we substitute one as the other? And so when we think about that kind of activity versus business impact, usually how we see this broken down is in kind of project management versus strategic planning. So let's start on the project management side. April, you mentioned you have a background in this, but on the project management side, what we're typically talking about there, a lot of you might have a PMO office that actually oversees this. We're typically talking about kind of some milestones and tasks related around maybe a big initiative or investment that you all are making as a business. It's usually very specific to that project team. They might bring in other stakeholders related to it, but at that project management level, we're really focusing on how are we doing at getting from A to B in terms of tasks. How are we moving the needle forward and getting from, hey, we have a blank screen to a product being built. That said, one of the risks we see with this is if we try to take project management and we try to substitute that as strategy, usually what we end up with is a very, very cluttered plan in a siloed team. We tend to see plans with like 30 objectives per team, or maybe they have fewer objectives, but you look underneath them and they've got, 15 to 30 tasks underneath them that's really measuring whether or not they did that. Usually when we see objectives, names that come from more of that project management lens, we see things that start with things like, we're going to deliver X, Y, and Z. We're going to create A, B, C. That verb at the onset tends to be more action-oriented on just getting something and taking it from 0 to 1. Maybe it's usually measured in a more binary way of, did we do it? Did we not do it? And that's where we kind of start to see like, hey, this might be really a project plan that's being disguised as strategy. April, I know you have lived this in past lives with other folks working with project managers, trying to transform that to strategy. So not sure if you have anything that comes to mind there, but I know that was very much your world.
Yeah, definitely. So previously I was working for Smartsheet, and so tons of project management there. And oftentimes customers would come to me asking, how can I build a strategic dashboard, or how could I have my strategic plan with this, what I already have in the platform? The answer to that was we could make something for sure. It was not usually what executives wanted because it was really reporting or rolling up all of those tasks from a PMO level. So really, really great for project portfolio management. But at the end of the day, that's what they were also getting. So it didn't usually get them exactly what they wanted. And no, as I mentioned earlier, this is something I've talked with Abby about at length, of seeing both sides of it and how those are usually put together.
Yeah, I think that's, so true, which is like executives generally want to know how things are going, but like the task level is usually a few layers too deep. And I think this kind of brings us to the flip side of this, which is, all right, if it's not project management, then let's talk about this on the strategic planning side. When we look at this from the strategic planning angle, strategic planning is obviously focused on strategy. It's in the name, right? We're focused on kind of more of that long-term vision piece. And it's usually connected, it's usually very cross-functional. Your strategic plan should be cross-functional. It should not be something that only one team is working on. This should span a lot more horizontally. That said, when we see folks try to substitute strategic planning as project management, they're going to get frustrated because it's going to be too high level. It's usually going to lead to a confused team who's looking for maybe something more tactical and they're seeing a strategy. And so when we think about project management versus strategic planning, we really like to take the approach to say, it's not necessarily one versus the other, but really, how do we bring these together and say project management and strategic planning? Where is the overlap here? Because both have their correct place and can be used correctly, but we don't want to necessarily substitute one for the other. And so when we start to see that our project management and our strategic plan are connected, we're able to then keep the strategy separate, keep that high level, and keep the project management piece separate and allow that to go more detailed. But in this kind of middle ground of the Venn diagram, what we're able to then do is have a more unified understanding of how our projects impact business impact. How do the things that we're doing over here, how does moving that forward affect our business? We also start to be able to obviously get some meaning given to those tasks. But I think more importantly, it allows us to not necessarily just operate on a waterfall kind of project management style. It allows folks to be more agile, or what we often refer to as dynamic, to understand that, hey, this is what we thought we were going to set out to do, but these tasks maybe aren't getting us to where we need to go. And so we're going to pivot as we go through this plan. We're going to make some tweaks and adjustments. For most folks that we work with in kind of the SaaS space, we see this done really, really well within project management and engineering teams. And we want to say, hey, that actually belongs within strategy too. We don't want to just be waterfall. We want to be agile, but we can only do that if we're connecting that project piece to the strategy. And then most importantly, is we're actually able to identify and measure success. We see so many folks rolling out strategic plans that are really just really long project plans. And they get to the end of the year and they can tell that they haven't achieved success. But one, it's usually too late to do anything about it. Or two, the whole team never had a unified understanding of what success looked like to begin with, because they weren't actually measuring anything. And so we want to be able to say, like, yes, this is going well, or no, this is not going well, in an objective way, so that we as the leaders within these industries and the leaders within our teams can then say, great, it's not going well. Here's how we're going to adjust to make it go better. Or, hey, this is going great. Let's double down here. So again, we want to bring these together. To us, it is not one or the other. It is bringing them together to say, yes, they can work really, really well together. But we need to be very clear and very specific on what are the true business impacts, not just what are we doing, or else we do all these tasks and we get to the end and say, well, we did it, check the boxes, but we don't actually know if that had the results that we want to. I know I mentioned at the onset, some of you probably joined the first session we had on strategic planning framework, and I'm going to actually reference a slide that was gone through in that webinar because it's a really good jumping off point for us to dive in deeper here. But when we think about our strategic planning framework, we typically start with that mission, vision, and values. That's going to be those guiding principles. They tend to not change, or at least not change frequently. And then we dive into that right side where we start at the top with those operational metrics. Again, a lot of you were thinking about these from that first question we asked. Those then drive us down into our themes. Those tend to be set on an annual basis. Sometimes those will persist year over year. Sometimes one or two might change. We break those themes down then to objectives. But that's where we start to get to this purple section here at the bottom around tactics and outcomes. That's what we're going to be spending our time on here today. And so as we think about mission, vision, values, we're going to throw some examples up here. Again, we want to then drive down from where are we trying to go. So maybe it is one of those top line revenue numbers. Maybe it's your margin. Maybe it's something else that you guys are tracking within your business. Go down to our themes. So in the example we're going to press in here today, we're looking at a company that's trying to drive $30 million in recurring revenue. And they're going to focus a theme this year on driving indispensability to operations leaders. They're then going to break that down and say, hey, in order for us to do this and hit our revenue goals, we're going to be focusing on expanding within the enterprise market, for example. And now we need to think about how we're going to do that. This is where we see folks immediately want to jump to the tactics, which is not inherently bad. When we do that, we see things like, okay, we got to go and develop an enterprise sales playbook. We go and see folks do all of these things. But then what we need to make sure happens is that we actually have success in going to the enterprise market. We can do all the things all day, but if we don't see, hey, in Q1, we want to exceed 2 million within that market, we can't necessarily measure whether or not those activities are having the result that we want. So let's dive in deeper on this example here. If we start again at that top level, when we're coming up with objective names, we want to make sure that this is a high-level goal that actually ties into our strategy. This is not day-to-day keep the lights on work. Your whole job description or tasks within your company should not be what's listed out in objectives. We intentionally give kind of some guardrails here of like 2 to 4 objectives because we don't want to see a laundry list of tasks. And then those should then be measured by our outcomes and tactics. And so again, using our enterprise, expanding the enterprise market example here, you'll notice that the verb that we're starting with is intentional and it is going to drive us towards something measurable. If we just had in here like, oh, we need to go create the playbook for enterprise. Again, we see that word create. A lot of times we'll see kind of develop or things like that. That's usually our marker that we might need to refine our objective name. But then we want to think through how we're actually going to measure this. When we get down to the measurement piece, we want to encourage folks to start with outcomes. And there's kind of a layer in between here that we would encourage folks to think about. We're going to dive into this more, but we really encourage folks to think internally about the purpose statement of kind of the why behind expanding in our enterprise market. Again, we're going to go through iterations of this here in just a little bit, but we encourage folks to start with the outcomes. For those that are fans of 7 Habits, we want to begin with the end in mind. Where are we trying to go? And how do we make sure that that's something quantifiable that actually changes something within the business that is important for us? Then, once we have those outcomes, we can start to think through, great, now that we know our destination, what are the steps that we're going to take to get there? So in this example, again, maybe we have an outcome around driving the revenue piece, and maybe we want to come up with a little bit more of a leading indicator than that. And so we want to look at driving pipeline as well to make sure that, hey, we're not just trying to get here, but we're also trying to have enough pipeline in order to get there. Those would be really good examples of outcomes that are going to measure the success of this objective. It's going to allow us to get to the end of the quarter or end of the year and say, yes, we did it, or no, we did not. On the tactics level, then, it's great. How are we actually going to get there? This is where we can start to think through more milestone pieces around developing the playbook or deploying specific ads. Again, as you start to look at the language and the verbs here, you're going to see things more like create, deploy, develop. Those, again, are going to be typically more tactic focused. But again, those tactics are going to be high level outputs. They're hoping to have direct impact on the outcome success. And generally speaking, we still want to keep tactics high level. This should not be a full project plan. That is for project management. We want to make sure that folks are doing those things, but we want to keep this more at the milestone level that we could report out on, because these are the things that we're going to look and say, okay, if our pipeline's not 4Xing, maybe it's only 2Xing, maybe these aren't the right tactics. Maybe we need to adjust and pivot. So we've gone through a lot here on the differences of what we're talking about with business impact, the activity piece, again, how that plays out, typically what we see within project management and strategic planning and how those can be brought together. I want to take a step back here and we want to dive into a little bit more around like signs and symptoms. How do you know if this applies to you? There may be several of you who are already like, no, this definitely applies. If you're not sure, we want to press into that of what do we typically see when we're seeing folks struggle with this in particular.
And I think, Abby, you teed that up so well. You mentioned you want to know your destination. So we want to know where we're going. And something we've talked with prospects and customers on. And Abby, I know you just did this drive yesterday. So if, for example, I was telling Abby, okay, drive from Indy to Chicago, just get on 65 and don't get off until you get to Chicago. That's great. She's obviously going to know that where she's going, but if there's an accident or there's a more efficient way to get there, depending on if her goal was to get there as quick as she could, or if their goal was to get there with saving money. So if she was trying to get there as quick as she could, she might look at the GPS and see, is there another route I could take to get there? Or if it was to save money, she probably wouldn't use the toll road. So all that to say, one of the biggest signs and symptoms that we usually see is that inability to be dynamic. So you really only have those steps that you're taking to get somewhere, but you don't really know where you're going. So you can't make the decision to, what we like to say, pivot or persist. So you don't know where you should maybe change what you're doing because you might be going away from where you're trying to go, or where you should keep going. So if we go to the next slide, sorry, Abby. This is really where we start talking about how we're taking that tactical execution to connect it to the long-term vision. And that's where we usually see that gap there. So typically this would look like distractions or derailment or priority fatigue. So we aren't taking those intentional speed bumps, like we like to call them. Those are those intentional pauses that we are using to lift our heads up to see how our daily activities are going or driving towards that business outcome or impact, or maybe away from it, so that we are able to, again, pivot or persist whatever we're doing. This is oftentimes where we also see that inability with a team to discern what is urgent and what's important. Because at that time, we are so focused on just crossing the tasks off our list, we lose sight of why we're doing it in the first place. I think a really good way to think about this is we can cross all of those tasks off, but we still might not reach our goal at the end of our objective. So I think another customer recently shared with Abby and I an analogy of their team saying, I can't look at the map because I'm driving 95 miles an hour. And that's great. We want to go fast. I think especially right now, everybody's trying to figure out how could we move faster. But it's also important to think about where are you headed? So something that Abby and I talk about a lot has been, how do we move faster, but also move further? Because if you're just going faster, you still might not go any further.
Yeah, April, this was something that was, you mentioned I was driving to Chicago yesterday. And I feel like this was a really big topic, was like folks getting really inundated with the like urgent topics, and they're so activity focused. It's like, well, we've got, 5 new fires burning today. And I think, yeah, oftentimes what we see, and it leads to this like priority fatigue, is everything's a priority. And it's like, well, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And I think yeah, that's often a really big symptom of that tactical piece. And so, yeah, this is just super top of mind with that conversation yesterday around really taking a step back to say, like, we're going to have to let some fires burn, and it feels really uncomfortable, but those fires don't get us closer towards the long-term vision. But when you're missing that, obviously you kind of see like the break in the bridge here. When you're missing that, it's really, really hard to actually make that discernment. So yeah, very top of mind, I feel like, and relevant for even the session yesterday that we were leading.
Definitely. And looking at how we can kind of bridge that gap, really looking at how we take that tactical execution and really tie it to the long-term vision is with those business impacts or those outcomes. That is really where we're able to see where are we trying to go. And we really heavily, if you're a customer of ours or a prospect, you probably know we've said this 1,000 times. We really believe in autonomy through clarity. So if we give our team that ability to see where we're trying to go or what that business impact is, they are able to then see, okay, is the activity I'm doing going to get me there? Or is it going to be something that I just cross off the list and it's done, but it never moved us further? And it really enables your team to take that on themselves and to see, what can I do to actually get us closer to our goal? And it helps change that mindset, I think, from that me to we. Something I think that's so heavy in project management is ownership, because things have to get done. And that is super important. But looking at something like a business impact, or maybe that outcome Abby had mentioned earlier of trying to reach a certain ARR or an NRR number, if you put all of that ownership on one person, that feels super, super daunting. And it's really about changing that mindset of, it's not just on me to help us get that to that goal or that outcome. It's really a team activity. And so really trying to change that mindset is a huge part of trying to get to those measurable outcomes and to really help enable your team with that autonomy through clarity.
Yeah, I feel like a broken record for those that are customers on this call. If I've chatted with you, I've probably used this phrase because I think it is so important, because we see teams, for those that get the pulse, I think this went out yesterday, but like we see teams and team members and employees and frontline managers that are desperate to know like what they're working on and how it relates, but they often get things so reduced down to a task level and they don't actually have insight into that business impact. That's where they get kind of exhausted, or even just like they start doing things that may not even feel right, but they're like, well, that's what I measured on. I measured on if I've done X, Y, Z. Or I think about this a lot from like a business development example of like, well, I've made my 100 calls today. And it's like, great. Did we book any demos? Did those demos convert? Like what's the direction we're headed here? And I find that employees are way hungrier for this than people often realize. And so that autonomy piece, like your team often wants to be very autonomous, and usually us as leaders want our team to be autonomous. That said, they are only enabled to do that when they have clarity about where they're going. And then we give them the reins to say like, hey, this is where we're headed. Talk to me about how you want to get there. They might lay out a initial proposal there, and that's great. And then we check in throughout and say, okay, are we getting closer? Or are we not getting closer? If we're not getting closer, how do we need this to change? And so I think a lot of times it's hard to overstate that, like, we want to focus on simplicity here. We don't need to overcomplicate things and micromanage. We want to keep things high level to an extent, but enable folks clarity on why does what they're doing matter? How does it impact our business? So yeah, I know this was, again, if you all read the post that our CEO Brooks writes every other week, this was a big piece that he was pressing in on yesterday with that. And it just has resonated a ton with some of the conversations we've been having. Is leadership wants their team to go run, go do. But those employees typically are wanting to make sure that they're headed in the right direction, moving further. So we've chatted quite a bit about kind of the differences here, the signs and symptoms, what does this look like when it's going wrong? What we want to pivot into then is, great, how do I adjust? Let's say this feels super relevant to you all, or some of you are like, yes, this is what we're facing in our business. Tell me what to do about it. That's what we're going to be shifting in here towards the end. And I do want to encourage folks that we are going to save some time for questions at the end, but especially in this session here, and maybe on some of the things that we've covered earlier, if there are questions, would love to have you drop those in the chat. We're happy to either answer them live if it's relevant then, or again, save them for our Q&A time here at the end, but feel free to go ahead and drop those. All right. How to adjust. What do we do when our plan looks like a project plan? What do we do when our strategy looks like an endless task of to-dos? Let's talk about it. We often internally will use this language of kind of outcomes and outputs. And when we think about this, our outputs are the actions, the activities. In our platform, you'll see these as tactics, but those outputs, again, are the things that I'm outputting on a daily basis to say, done, done, done. I've checked this off the list. It's my, running to-do list. That said, we want those outputs to be driving outcomes. Those outcomes, again, are those business impact metrics that we're trying to change or influence in some way. And April, I think you hit on a really important part here, which is outcomes are often not owned by one person in particular. In fact, they pretty much never are. When we think about something like a revenue number, it might be easy to say like, yep, sales owns that number. And sure, sales may be responsible for closing those deals, and that impacts that measure. But what is sales selling, right? They're usually selling some sort of product or service, and that is very much created by other areas of the business. And so I do want to go ahead and add a caveat here to say that just because you do not solely own an outcome or are not the person directly doing that number doesn't mean it shouldn't be tied to your objective. If we think about shifting from me to we, as April shared, these outcomes are often a lot more shared metrics. They, again, are usually focused a little bit higher level, and sometimes we'll see these on multiple objectives. Let's dive into maybe a real example. When we think about turning an output into an outcome, the best way we can do this is asking ourselves why over and over and over again. This can be a very annoying process, and I want to start by saying, like, if it feels hard, that's because it is. But through asking ourselves why, we usually are able to start to drive towards that outcome. We're going to start with a really relevant example that we keep hearing, which is everyone wants to build an AI feature. We're going to keep this pretty generic and general up at the top. Everyone's like, great, maybe your CEO comes to you and says, we got to build AI into this. Perfect. Maybe that's a great strategy, but why do we want to do that? What's our intention in building the AI feature? Or if it's not an AI feature, insert new feature or new product or service offering here. Why do we want to do that? If we're going to add a new kind of product line or something like that, if we don't, again, begin with the end in mind, we're just going to go check off some tasks and not actually know if those had the change that we wanted to see within our business. So let's ask ourselves why. Why do we want to build an AI feature? And maybe we think about that and we say, well, it's really important that we start to expand our offering. Maybe that's something you're hearing from the board. Maybe that's something, again, you're hearing from your CEO or your executive team of like, we've got to expand our offering. Ask again, why? Why do I want to expand our offering? Why is that important to our business? This answer is going to look different. We're going to give one example here, but for every business, this might be really different. Let's say for our example company here, it's because you want to add more value to your customers. It's like, okay, that sounds really good. We've already asked ourselves why twice. We've probably spent a lot of time thinking about this. We're still not to an outcome though. We got to ask ourselves why again. Why is it important that we add value to our customers? And I don't mean this in a silly way of like, well, what do you mean? Why is it important? Obviously it's important. It's like, no, actually answer that. Why is it important that we add value to our customers? Well, at the end of the day, we want to do that because we got to increase our ACV. Maybe our ACV is too low to kind of look at the scale of what it costs us to acquire a customer. And so we need to increase that to make sure that our unit economics are in order. We've got to increase our ACV. You'll notice now we're starting to get to an outcome here. And this, again, as you ask yourself why again, can take a number of different paths. Maybe the why behind that is you want to start to see an increase in new business, or maybe in order to increase that ACV, you want to see this more on an upsell revenue number here. Either way, as you get further down that pipeline, and in this example, it took 4 whys. Maybe for you, it'll take 8. For some, it might take 2. This is going to look a little different for everyone. But when we keep asking ourselves why, we start to get to the root of why are we building XYZ feature, or why are we rolling out XYZ service? And that is really because at the end of the day, we're trying to drive more revenue, or we work with a number of different nonprofits. This example still applies there. If like, why are we rolling out this new program? Maybe it's the number of lives you want to impact within here. How can we measure that? Maybe we're trying to drive more development dollars. Again, this can be a very, very frustrating process. As I mentioned, we've been having a lot of these conversations with folks, both prospects and customers alike recently. And usually by the second or third time you ask yourself why, people start to get frustrated or annoyed. And that's because this gets harder to answer. That said, we want to encourage people to press in. When it gets hard, usually you got to ask why 1 or 2 more times to truly get to that number. You will quickly notice in this example that we started with what would likely be something tasked to the product or engineering team within this, fictitious example. What we ended with was some sort of revenue number, and that might feel uncomfortable. Maybe this isn't something that you're used to doing within your business, and assigning some sort of revenue number like this on an objective that feels more focused on the product or engineering team is something that your team's going to be like, whoa, 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 like, wait a second, this is not cool. We don't actually have any impact on upsell revenue. And this is where we want to press in and really challenge you probably to say, actually you do. And no, you're not the person talking to a customer, maybe getting that proposal or that contract signed. But if we don't think about why we're doing something, then we only focus on the what. What are we building? We're building this. We don't focus on the why, and we don't focus then on how do we build it. Because the why is going to influence the way in which you build something. It's going to impact your scope. I cannot tell you the number of times we hear customers talking about, we want to roll this new feature out, but then it's always delayed. And when it's delayed, we miss out on revenue. And it's like, well, usually that's because the scope keeps getting bigger. And so if we have the why in mind, and we keep both our go-to-market teams, and in this case, our product teams aligned to that and having the same strategy, then we're able to say like, hey, this is going to increase that scope. Maybe we need to just start here. If we're trying to drive revenue with upsells and we need to do that sooner rather than later, we can have the right conversations when something starts to delay so that we can get in front of it and make the right decision in that moment with the right information. More often than not, it's really easy to look back on this after the fact and say like, oh, we should have done this different. But we don't usually have the info we need in the moment. If we start to focus on those outcomes from the onset, then we can start to have the information we need to make the tweaks or pivots as April was sharing. So went through a big example here, but again, typically these outcomes are easy to do on your sales team. It's a lot harder to do when you get to that product side or maybe an internal operations side, but we still want to work this down and connect all the way down to something that can truly be measured. All right. Let's dive into some best practices here. April will let you take this on, but we want to talk about like how do we actually go about doing this? What are some best practices, things to keep in mind as you're going through this process?
Yeah. So as Abby already mentioned, we went through a lot. So as you're trying to create these outcomes, some things to think about here. So the first one would be, don't overdo it. Start by creating 1 or 2 measurable results that are focused, intentional, and actually speak to that business impact. So start small here. It doesn't have to be everything at once. From there, really, really strike a balance. We're not saying now all of a sudden you don't need those outputs or anything like that. There is a blend of those. So it's not all or nothing. We really want to blend those high level milestones or those outputs with those measurable outcomes to really help us identify those leading and lagging indicators. From there, really progress over perfection. If you're a customer or prospect, you've probably heard us say this numerous times. And as Abby already mentioned, if it feels hard, it's because it is. It's very difficult to try to start focusing more on outcomes than outputs. But don't make it more difficult than it needs to be, especially as you're getting started. As Abby mentioned, you might ask yourself why 2 times and start feeling really, really frustrated. And that's totally normal. And it's a muscle that you need to build. So it's not something that's just going to happen overnight. And I think it really ties back with the don't overdo it. You can start small. You can start by just working with your leadership team and saying, what are a couple measurable outcomes we can have for some of our objectives? And then start working with the rest of your teams as you do that. So really want to hone in here. You don't have to make this switch overnight. It is really hard to try to do that. And it can be very frustrating and disheartening to try to do that. And so we really, again, progress over perfection. We wholeheartedly believe in that.
Yeah, I say a lot of times, like slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Take that time at the onset, lean in. Again, just start with progress, but the more work you put into this at the onset, the better that's going to pay dividends down the road. So often I think people get to the end of the kind of planning season and they're just like, all right, I'm just ready to wrap this up, put a bow on it and be done with it, store it up on a shelf. But when you go to revisit that plan, if you don't have outcomes, you're going to feel it. So I had someone recently talk to me about like doing favors for their future self. Do a favor for your future self, work on it now, because the more measurable you can get now, the easier then the execution of your plan is going to be. I would also say, we don't have this tip on here, but when you are getting to that outcome and you're getting to something measurable, just because it is a measurable number doesn't mean you can actually track it. If you do not have the support set up to track a metric, then don't put it as an outcome because you're going to then have to go try to track that and you're not going to have a system to do it. And so when you do this, do get practical with it. Maybe that means we're using the best proxy number we have. That's okay. Again, progress over perfection. Make sure that if you are looking at a metric, it is something that you could go in and find within a system today, and that it's not just a fictitious number that, the metric or the KPI sounds great in theory, but you don't actually have a way of tracking it. So I do want to make sure I mention that because we do see some folks get really excited and aggressive and they write down all these outcomes and then you ask them like, great, like what's the target for that? And they're like, well, we don't know. We don't have a baseline for it. We don't actually track that. So I will kind of add that caveat there. We want to make sure you can measure that today, and definitely make sure that you have a target. Sometimes that target is going to be, just a guess in the wind, probably a little bit of an educated guess, and that's okay. Do put a target down though, because that tells you where you're going. And then after a quarter or two, you can benchmark and say like, whoa, we set a way too aggressive, or maybe we set way too easy of a target. We need to adjust. You can always adjust, but if you set no target, chances are you're not going to actually be driving towards anything. And again, April, to your point, like maybe you'll just get on Highway 65 and you don't know where you're going to end up, which exit you're going to take. So we want to, again, have those target values to actually give us that direction. All right. We want to start to open this up to questions. So again, we have the chat open for folks if you guys want to drop some in. Saw a question or two pop in while we were going through that session that I think would be good to start pressing it on here. But for those that are online, go ahead and drop some questions in the chat. We'll kind of sort through those as we go. To start, and April, maybe this is a question for you. We have an individual that said, oh, how many outcomes and how many tactics are too many? That quantity is a good question. I feel like you coach folks on this quite a bit.
Yeah. I feel like that is a very common question that we get of when do I stop? And I think it's really important too, as we've mentioned, of starting with, as you're getting going, it's not about all of the quantity. So really starting small and getting to where your team is really building that muscle. But if you're saying, oh my gosh, I have all of these outcomes now, and my team really, really has all these outcomes, it's really about thinking about, is this really a business impact, or how is this impacting our business? And is this really connecting to our objective, or is this something that we're just kind of measuring? And that's fine if it is. It's really about refining those business impacts. So is it going to help us show that we're getting closer to our goal or our objective? Or is it something we also just want to measure? So I think that's also something to keep in mind. I think a lot of times as well, and Abby, please chime in here as well. I'm sure you hear this a lot, but how do I know if I have too many tactics? I think it's really that discernment of project management versus strategic planning. And is this a day-to-day task that we're just doing? It's part of our everyday. This is just how we do things, or is it something that's actually getting us closer to that overall goal? So if we want to reach a certain revenue number, but to do that, we need to create a whole new sales playbook, for example, a tactic for that objective might be create new sales playbook. So not any of those day-to-day things we're doing, but something more designed to help us get to that overall goal or outcome.
Yeah, honestly, April, I think that's a perfect example of like, maybe the tactic is, develop a playbook. What it's not is draft first playbook, send to so-and-so for approval of first playbook, like enablement up, like we're not going down to that level. If you are, I would highly recommend you look into one of the many great project management tools out there that exist, because I think you'll find that those are better suited for that level. But we want to make sure that that's, again, married into one of our objectives and how we're actually doing there. So yeah, I think on the tactic list and level in particular, this is probably more of an art than just a science here, where you need to go and say, okay, what are the top level milestones that, our audience of, maybe your audience usually is going to be the executive team. What do they need to be informed of? I would say 9 times out of 10, your exec team doesn't necessarily want to know every single task. They just want to know what tasks are moving the needle, and if those are high level, on pace, or behind. So I would kind of use that gut check there. Usually less is more. I would start with less, and you can always add in more later. But again, given that oftentimes these are going to change, because you're going to measure those outcomes and see if they're headed in the right direction or not, I would definitely say start higher level. You can always add more later. If you add too much, you end up with just a lot of heavy oversight. And while your project plan is something you should be updating every single day, your strategic plan and the cadence we often see is kind of on that weekly or maybe fortnightly, bi-weekly basis. And so generally speaking, I would say that if you're trying to track too many tasks granularly, it's going to be too much for you on a bi-weekly basis. And we see folks start to check out and then they just won't update it. That's how we end up with kind of some, what we call like our dusty plans that have been sitting on a shelf. All right. Another question in here is, I've tried to get my team to measure outcomes. They're super resistant. How do you suggest overcoming this? First of all, you're not alone. And this is something that's super common. And usually this is common because folks just don't know what outcome to measure. Usually it's not that they're against measuring an outcome. It's just like, I don't even know where to start. And that might feel daunting. I actually would anchor us back to that original question that we asked at the start of this webinar, which was, what's a North Star metric from you? For an executive team you're working with, start with like, what metrics do we report to our board? That's going to be a really helpful place to start, because the board is always going to be wanting to look at numbers. Again, they may also care that some things get done, but they're getting done because it's going to drive a measurement. And so I would recommend that with your team, you start there. Maybe it's throwing out some examples to them of like, hey, I know every quarter we report to our board on X, Y, and Z. Like, let's start there. Where are those represented within our plan? Do we have any objectives that are specifically tied towards changing those? Maybe we want to increase that gross margin, or again, as we dive in there, it might look different for different businesses, but I would really recommend folks starting with asking yourself what you report to the board. Start back at that top with those operational metrics. And that's going to help get folks kind of thinking through this. Again, usually folks aren't resistant to the idea of outcomes. What they're typically resistant to is like, I don't know where to start on this. So that's one piece I would definitely encourage folks to press into there. Really start to think more about what are those top line outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's another example as well of what we had talked about just a minute ago, of progress over perfection, and that this is something that's hard. So your team being resistant to this is not uncommon at all. It is, like we mentioned, a muscle that you're trying to build. So starting with those metrics that are reported to the board, or those really key metrics that you're aware of, and saying, okay, how can we tie these to any objectives, or how can we make that connection, and kind of showing what that looks like. And as Abby mentioned, it's something that can feel very daunting. So stressing again that progress over perfection to your team could be helpful as well.
Yeah. I see another question here around, my team wants to only measure what we can directly impact. Is this a problem? It's not a problem, but this I think is common. I'm guessing what we're getting at with this one is around like, if I don't own the number, I don't want to track it. And I think that there's validity to that stance. I think that we don't only want to measure, again, we don't only want to measure outcomes. We do also have to include some things here around how are we going to get there. That said, when we see folks, in April, I think you actually mentioned this with like the project plan piece of like, that is very ownership focused. And yes, we need to have ownership and accountability within the strategy too. That said, if we are only focused on that, what we often see time and time again is that halfway through the year or 3/4 of the way through the year, usually when they're revisiting their strategy to build their next one, we were only looking at our leading indicators and we never looked at those lagging ones. Those lagging indicators, again, are usually never owned by just one person. So I do think that we can encourage folks to say, yes, absolutely, you should also measure what you can directly impact. But we need to make sure that we're measuring that we're actually getting to the end result as well. And so this is where, again, it's that both and it's not just one or the other. And so I think that's what I would share there. Just making sure that you're kind of continuing to push to say, like, acknowledge this is a shared metric. If this goes off pace, just because it's on an objective that you're responsible for updating, doesn't mean you're the only one driving towards that. But it does mean that when it goes off track, we as a team, a leadership team, need to come around this and say, hey, this is where we're at. This is where we wanted to be. It's not the same. How do we close that gap? What are we going to do? Not what are you going to do or what am I going to do, but what are we as a team going to do? How can we support each other in that? So is it a problem? No, if you're also then still tying in those outcomes. On the surface, it sounds great, but we want to make sure we're tying that back there. And again, this is going to, like any muscle that you build, first few times you exercise it, you're going to feel more sore. That's okay. Keep going. It will get easier and soon you'll have your team focusing more on those outcomes, but it is something you have to walk into, take a stair-stepped approach. So that's what we'd kind of share there. I do see a question around if the deck will be sent after. Everyone will get a link to the recording of this, so you will be able to see that afterwards as well. If there's specific resources that you're interested in, feel free to send us a note. We can help out with that. But yes, everyone will get the recording of this webinar afterwards, and you'll be able to kind of reference back to the different slides that we've created. All right. One other question here is, how can I, as a chief of staff, better drive our team towards outcomes? All we come up with is outputs. I think this is a really, really relevant one because the reality is your whole team is probably not on this webinar. If they are, great. But usually when we're chatting with folks, people who are joining us are people who are like, yes, 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 this. How can I make an impact? And I think it's pushing those why conversations. I think it's being the person to say, like, hey, I'm not trying to be annoying on this. I'm not trying to frustrate you, but like, can you tell me why that's important? Be the voice that speaks up to ask that why, or how are you actually going to measure that? Sometimes all it takes is just starting with asking the question to get folks to start thinking about it. And so I think as strategy and operations leaders, not only is it a role we have to take on, but it's a role we get to take on, is to ask the what may feel like a dumb or obvious question. Press in on it, do ask it, and then give the team space to then think about it. Give the team space to ideate on that. Don't be afraid to ask why again, but I think oftentimes when you're sitting in that room coming up with your strategy, or hey, maybe you're wanting to do this for the remainder of this year, ask the why. Like, hey, I know this was a big objective for us. Why are we doing that again? What are we trying to change here? So I would say that's kind of the role that we typically would recommend for those of you in a chief of staff role. even those in maybe a chief strategy officer role or even a transformation office role, getting to be that voice, I think is a big piece there. So don't be afraid to ask why.
Abby, I think you highlighted something of asking, what are we trying to change or what are we trying to influence? I think is also a good place to start. Sometimes asking why too many times, like we already mentioned, it can get frustrating when you're trying to get to that ultimate outcome or that ultimate why. Starting with, okay, what are we trying to change or influence can also be a good question to ask as you're trying to figure out what outcomes we should be driving towards for your objectives. So something else to keep in mind, but something I think we've both seen that can be helpful for teams is they're trying to come up with those outcomes for their plan.
Absolutely. All right. I think those are the questions that we've had in the chat so far. If there's any others, please feel free to drop them in. That said, while we give some space and time for that, for any last minute questions, I do want to make sure we mention that this is session 2 of a 4-part session of Blueprint Live. So again, we hosted an event a few months ago, and the overwhelming response was like, give me more. So we want to keep diving deeper. Our next session is on October 15th. So we have a little bit of a break here. And I am really excited to share that we're going to be focusing in on a product demo around a new feature we're developing called Insights. For many of you who we've chatted with, this sounds familiar, but we want to give folks a sneak peek into how are we going to help enable you to do that within our product, within our platform? How can we start to look at some rules around this to give us heads up on when we're tracking too many outputs and not enough outcomes? So be on the lookout. We just dropped that in the chat to everyone, so you can go ahead and see how to sign up for that webinar. We'll send out an email on this as well if you haven't signed up yet. I guarantee you that's going to be a really great one. I think we even have one of our SVP of engineering joining, who's been a big influence, obviously, in building out this feature. So he doesn't get on webinars very frequently, but we're excited for him to join us, and looking forward to chatting with you guys then. If there are any other questions in the meantime, please reach out to us. We'd love to chat with you, whether you're a current customer or not a customer. Again, April and I love to talk about this.